Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on. And I just have a couple of comments on the news today, and then we have a guest. One of the big things getting a lot of attention is Trump. He's out there calling for death and destruction if he's indicted or when he's indicted. And he's calling his black prosecutors, which include Alvin Bragg in New York, Fonnie Willis in Atlanta, and Tish James, the Attorney General of New York State. He's calling them animals. He's calling them human scum. He's calling them racist, which is basically to play up on the white racist trope of white victimhood. And he's leading in the Republican polls. So that problem remains. But meanwhile, Biden is moving to the right and repudiating the progressives in his own party as he gears up for his reelection campaign. He's about to kick off millions off of Medicaid with the declaration of the end of the COVID emergency, which made it easier for people to stay on Medicaid. He's implementing Trump's policy of summarily deporting asylum seekers, even if this Title 41 thing that Trump got in there to deport people because of the COVID emergency gets knocked out in court. He's setting it up so he can just deport people without them having their due process. And we saw, I think it was not this week, but the week before, that even Russian war resistors are being deported back to Russia. He's greenlighting the Willow Oil Project up there in Alaska on public land, which is a carbon bomb. He's about to sign a Republican bill to overturn District of Columbia criminal justice reforms, which, what happened to statehood, which was one of the things he said he would do for DC when he campaigned for president. And he's bailing out rich depositors at the Silicon Valley Bank beyond the $250,000 that the FDIC guarantees. So there's, as Ralph Nader put it, there's socialism for the rich. And as Bernie Sanders, he said that too, and he said it's rugged individualism for the rest of us. So I think, and then we got both parties a couple days ago scapegoating TikTok in congressional hearings for its Chinese connections, when what we really need is a media data privacy and protection policy like the European Union has that protects our personal information on all social media platforms. And I think this all speaks to why we need to keep trying to build up the Green Party as a viable political alternative to both Republican neo-fascism and Democratic neoliberalism. So that's where we're at. And let's bring on our guest. His name is Stanley Heller, and he's the administrator of Promoting Enduring Peace, which is a 70-year-old peace organization based in Connecticut. He's a leader in solidarity campaigns for Palestinians and Syrians and Ukrainians. He's the author of a book, we'll put the link to it, called The Zionist Betrayal of Jews from Herzl to Netanyahu. And right now he's leading a campaign for uranium export sanctions against Russia. And there's a petition, and we'll put this link in the chat too, that has nearly 15,000 signatures at this point. And I hope people will consider signing that. And that's what I asked him to come on and speak about, as well as the emerging issue of depleted uranium munitions in Ukraine. So Stanley, welcome. And
thank you very much, Howie. Good to be here. So Promoting Enduring Peace and the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign decided to work together on a campaign to raise this issue of banning Russian uranium imports. And we did it for two reasons. One, to help Ukraine, but secondly, to stop nuclear power, which is very dangerous. So we want to hope this campaign will help phase out nuclear power. Now, I'm an old school teacher, middle school teacher, and I always thought pictures help a presentation. So I have one of those PowerPoint slideshows. So I'll show you a few pictures while I talk. So let me do that. I have to find it first. Okay, and I'm not going to have it full screen so I can read off my notes too. All right, I learned about this situation from a Russian exile named Vladimir Slivyak. He was speaking on Democracy Now! Last November, and you see him in that picture on the screen now. He was talking at the COP27 climate conference in Egypt, and he was explaining that Europe had made a massive effort to try to get off of its dependence on Russian natural gas and oil, but Europe and the US were freely importing uranium. So it turns out it's not just uranium, raw uranium rocks, but enriched uranium. You see, you can't just plunk uranium into a nuclear reactor. You have to turn it into a gas, and then it gets enriched. Basically, that means it concentrates the uranium-235, which is the stuff that's easy to break apart and release energy. And the U-235 is what they make the fuel rods for the nuclear reactors. And they also use that to make nuclear weapons. Now, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, they're famous for their that clock, you know, the doomsday clock. And they are atomic scientists, so smart people, as you know. So they say that Europe and the US customers of Russian uranium and the enriched uranium that comes to about $1 billion a year. And 21, the last year we have some real good statistics, 14% of the uranium purchases and 28% of the enrichment services for the United States alone came from Russia. And the company in Russia that does it is Rosatom. And here's some kind of exhibit they had a couple of years back. The environmental group Greenpeace France denounced the ongoing shipments and called for stopping of all trade in nuclear fuel, which it said was financing the war in Ukraine and extending Europe's energy dependence and delaying the transition to renewable energy. Now, as I said, we're absolutely not calling for replacing Russian uranium with reopening and expanding U.S. uranium mining. Go to the next picture there. By the way, this is a picture of a so-called Panamanian ship bringing fuel or going back and forth from the famed Dunkirk port of France over to, I think, St. Petersburg in Russia. So the US does not mine much uranium anymore. From 1940 to 1980, they dug up plenty out west, mostly on indigenous land, and they littered the countryside with toxic waste. This was especially hard on the Navajo Nation's land, and it was linked to cancer, and not only to the miners, The bigger issue is nuclear power itself. And I wrote a piece about this in 2015. There was a PBS special called Uranium Twisting the Dragon's Tail, which I thought was pretty poor. And I wrote a piece for Truth Dig, and I believe it's going to be sent to you in the chat there, the link to that article. Nuclear power is a really dangerous way to boil water, and that's the real problem. So, different problems. Meltdowns, that was theoretical for a long time. It actually occurred somewhere in Soviet Union, I don't recall, and there's a whole big swath that's a no-go place. But the most famous one, of course, in the Soviet Union was Chernobyl in '86. And the official death toll is, sort of minuscule, like 55 people, 80 people, something like that. And they said, well, maybe 4,000 people will get cancer at some point in their life that will kill them. And so you could say that's part of the problem, etc. But in Ukraine itself, and even before this last invasion, there was a piece on Democracy Now! In I guess it was 2019. 35,000 women in Ukraine get compensation for the death of their spouses because of Chernobyl, work at Chernobyl, or the rescue effort, or etc. So we're talking about a big deal. And then there's Fukushima, a lot more recent. And the big story there is not so much deaths that we can talk about, but contaminated water. Immense amounts of water are used to cool down the melt. I don't know what the phrase is, but the reactors that did melt down. And so they have to continually cool them to prevent more explosions. And you end up with radioactive water, which of course they say is slightly radioactive or mildly radioactive. It's something like over 1 million tons that they have to store, and they keep making new containers. They would like to release it into the Pacific and, take care of it that way. And then, well, we're not to that ready for that picture yet, but there's the question of nuclear waste. There's 72,000 tons of nuclear waste in the United States, some which will have to be stored and guarded for some time, 100,000 years, before some of this really bad stuff will have gone through its various half-lives to become lead and other harmless materials. And after 80 years of atomic power and nuclear work and so on, after 80 years, there's still no plan that's been adopted for permanent storage. And basically it just hangs around in pools and solid casks around the various nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons facilities. Now, that's been known as a danger for a long time, but over the last year only, there's a grave new problem. And that's the fact that what we all thought was obvious, that people in a war would just avoid the area where there was a nuclear power plant because they knew what had happened in Russia at Chernobyl, that common sense approach has not happened. And so Russian forces quickly took over Chernobyl, stayed there for a number of months, behaved in a very reckless fashion, from what we understand. And then they took over Zaporizhia, the biggest nuclear power complex in all of Europe. And there was, a battle, to take that over. And there was one building was pretty much destroyed in this. And there's all kinds of pools holding the spent nuclear rods that, if they are attacked and if that stuff gets into the atmosphere, you again have the radiation similar to what happened at Chernobyl. Russian forces have hid around the buildings or inside some of the buildings with tanks and other equipment, saying, well, the Ukrainians are not going to shell these buildings because they know they could cause a catastrophe. And nevertheless, I guess some of the Ukrainian forces have shot Russian forces near the buildings or over the buildings. And so, we're playing this nuclear chicken here. So the other thing is these nuclear power plants need electricity. Kind of odd because they produce electricity, but they actually have to be on the grid. And they've been cut off in Zaporizhia 6 times. I think the last time was about a month ago. So when they're cut off from the grid, they go on emergency power. I think they burn fossil fuels and they do that. But they're not supposed to do that for very long. And the equipment is not considered safe after 10 days. So far, they've not gone past the 10 days each of those 6 times. But it's a mad thing. It's a mad thing. So what we've done is, as Howie mentioned, is hoping to start this campaign. At this point, it's really a petition, and it's got close to 15,000 names. Of course, you know that you can get 1 million names on a petition, and they can ignore you. One nice thing you could do with petitions on change.org is you could send an email to the signers once a day and send them information. So we've done some stuff with that. But we'd like to get it to a full-blown campaign, let politicians know about it, and get people active, bring this as a matter to be brought up in various demonstrations about Ukraine, about nuclear issues, and so on. So if those of you would like to get involved, I think I gave my email, and it should be in the chat at some point. So please contact me. Now, there's another issue, and that's only surfaced the last week, and it's the question of so-called depleted uranium, and how he brought this up. This is a picture or a schema of a depleted uranium shell. Depleted uranium is incredibly dense, more dense than lead. And so it's a great penetrator when you're shooting at something. They also use it in armaments. They'll put the steel and then a layer of depleted uranium, and then another layer of steel or whatnot on the front of the tank or other military vehicle. And then they shoot it off. According to the Harvard International Review, depleted uranium is still radioactive. It's only 40% less radioactive than the original uranium ore. So it still has uranium-235 and then uranium-238, which is less radioactive with this incredible half-life. I forget the exact number, but what is it, like 100,000 years? Gets rid of half of it, and then another 100,000 years gets down to a quarter of the original, and so on. So it sends out these various alpha particles and other things. When one of these penetrators strikes a target the uranium, the depleted uranium, turns into a dust. And this is or can be inhaled by the soldiers who are near the site. If kids are playing around, and if there is various fragments, they pick it up, they play with it, the dust gets into their bodies, and the dust just spreads around. It's not gonna, dissolve into nothing. It's got a half-life. It's gonna be around virtually forever. And, there's a dispute about its health effects, but it's certainly carcinogenic. I mean, for one thing, it's chemically toxic, like lead and the heavy metals are chemically toxic, even if they're not radioactive. And then there's the question of the amount of danger from the radioactivity. And the World Health Organization does believe that inhaling a small amount of these uranium particles can damage the lungs and can cause lung cancer. And then there's the question of birth defects. And then when they used this in the war against Iraq, there were these hideous pictures of poor kids born with unbelievable defects. And some people said it was because of the depleted uranium that had been used in large amounts. They used it in Kosovo, and they used it in Iraq. And the report is that the Russians have already been using it in Ukraine. And let's see the authority here. They use something called 3BM32 VANT. It was confirmed by the Geneva International Center for Humanitarian Demining in a report of last year. And the last thing I'm going to do is show you a photo of a man named Herbert Reed, and then I'm going to play a short video I did with him many years ago. I think it was just before the Iraq invasion of 2003. He was a veteran of the Iraq, or they called it the Gulf War, in 91. So now let me find that link. And hopefully I can pull this in full screen. Let me stop sharing this first, and then get up the video. All right, I believe it's there. And I'll share this. Okay. And it's funny, I don't see all my windows. Are you seeing I'm sorry, I'm not all that familiar with this StreamYard. Are you seeing our TV show, or are you seeing something else here?
Seeing a blank screen, but something opened up.
Let me try it again. I apologize for this.
If you put the link in the chat, I can do it.
I'd appreciate if you would do it then. Thanks.
Is it the link that's in the private chat? The YouTube?
Yes. That's it.
I'm Herbert Reed. I'm a veteran of the Iraq War. I was contaminated with depleted uranium in 2003, and the U.S. government never notified its soldiers that they were utilizing depleted uranium or the harm that it could cause to the environment or the human component therein. And when I returned back, they still deny that depleted uranium is harmful to the soldiers. And when first asked if they could test for any depleted uranium in our system, we were told no. But we found that to be a lie in Warren Gonzalez of the Daily News, and the Daily News itself paid for our testing that was done in Frankfurt, Germany. We all tested positive from the 10 of us that were tested from the 442 Military Police Company in Orangeburg, New York. And what we've been trying to do is try to get the United States to stop using depleted uranium, do more testing, and before any more people can be harmed, any more soldiers or any more countries polluted without depleted uranium waste.
What exactly have been the physical symptoms you suffered that you think are from depleted uranium?
Boy, there's so many. I think the bone aches that I have, the constant chill and heat that I feel in my body. It's like it's going on simultaneously. I can feel cold and hot at the same time. I can feel every bone in my body, it seems, sometimes. The blood in my urine, the blood in my stool. I think it has to do with the herniated discs that I have in my body sometimes, I think. The nerve damage that I have, the respiratory problems that I have. I have to sleep with a CPAP machine at night now, and if I don't get a restful sleep. Um,
You're on disability from the Army?
yes, I am. At first, the military was reluctant to give me a disability, and I had to hire a lawyer to get what I was entitled to.
The authorities, of course, are minimizing the health effects of DU, but the Ukrainian
That's the end of the clip. That's the end of the clip. Now, I don't know. I'm certainly not qualified to know if all those symptoms were from the DU. If you remember, there was this thing they said, Gulf War syndrome. And for years, they said those people were, it was in their head, and that they weren't brave people or whatever. And all these physical things they complained about were not real. And it took a huge struggle for them to get recognition that whatever caused the problem, they ought to get some help. But that was Mr. Reed, and he's certainly one person that you have to take seriously his testimony. So that's my presentation. Be happy to talk about all these issues.
Okay, we're going to get questions and comments in the chat. While we're waiting, I just want to give a little report. We had Dennis Bondar, who was a Ukrainian physicist teaching at Tulane University, on this podcast a couple months ago. And afterwards, he sent me a letter from a nuclear worker at Zaporizhia, who's in the Union. And it's a very distressing letter. He said there were more soldiers running around the plant than nuclear workers, that there was military equipment and vehicles all over the place, pretty much in the way that the Russian soldiers were leaving garbage all over the place, which had become a fire hazard. As workers, they were being coerced into signing a contract with Rosatom, the Russian nuclear company, and they are all working for the Ukrainian nuclear company. And if they didn't sign, particularly management level, but this guy was more a nuclear worker, they could be fired. And a lot of them were, and he said they were hiring anybody off the street who had no qualifications, including alcoholics and drug addicts. The International Agency on Atomic Energy had a monitor there, but he said they were worthless. They were doing nothing. In the company town adjacent to the plant, he said that the Russian soldiers were looting people's homes and in some cases kicking them out and occupying them. And it was just, very distressing and shows, how serious the crisis is there. And the other comment I'll make is, I'm a Vietnam era veteran, and we had the same stuff from the Pentagon about Agent Orange and people that got sick because of that, which was, that was because of the dioxin in the defoliants they were spraying all over Vietnam. So that is a familiar, sad story. So let's see what questions and comments people have.
I actually wanted to jump in. I don't think I've ever done this since I've been teching. But about 10 years ago this month, I got involved with my state Green Party. And I went to my first state meeting in Southern Illinois, and we had our meeting in a lodge on a lake. And we were eating lunch, and, somebody said, hey, I'm going to go down and, put my feet in the lake and enjoy sitting out in nature. And everyone from Southern Illinois immediately went, no. And they looked at us very strangely. And we said, that lake's a Superfund site. It's irradiated. It's for decades, dating back to the World War, was the site of a munitions plant. And in modern times, that munitions plant made depleted uranium shells for the Bradley fighting vehicles. And so, we were technically in a very scenic spot out on a peninsula overlooking a beautiful lake that is now considered a wildlife refuge, but it's completely irradiated. So yeah, it's a wide-ranging impact, throughout all of it. But I'll jump to questions now. We just happened to talk about it on my decade anniversary of being officially involved in the party. So.
Okay, Violet at Content Boutique. I think it should be Frankie. I remember so much chat about depleted uranium during the Iraq war protests, and so many soldiers have died from cancer now. So it's
there was an article in Life magazine about this, and I can't find it on the internet, which is funny because you can always find everything, right? We had a fellow named Doug Rocky who came to New Haven and spoke, and he was in charge of a unit that was supposed to decontaminate tanks that had been hit by mistake, the friendly fire. He was talking about how they were given almost nothing in terms of protective equipment and so on. Now I understand he's gone on to become kind of controversial, but he sure made a lot of sense 20 years ago or whenever he came to New Haven.
well, going back to the depleted uranium munitions. I mean, why it's become a topical issue is that UK announced that they would include depleted uranium munitions shells with the tanks they were sending. And the Russians responded kind of hysterically, oh, that's nuclear war. Although they've been using depleted uranium munitions, it's been documented since the fall. I mean, the Iranians have captured some of their shells. And, people will say, well, the radioactivity is not dangerous because it's alpha radiation, which your skin can stop. But if it gets inside of you, then it can cause illness. As Stanley mentioned, if it gets in your lungs, it can cause lung cancer. And the chemical toxicity is well documented. So Then the question is the U.S. sending uranium munitions? They've been asked, and they say no comment. So
Right.
this is a problem on all sides, and there's been an international campaign to ban depleted uranium munitions for many years, and now is the time really to bring that demand up.
And to bring it up to the Ukrainian soldiers and the left movement in Ukraine, and to say, well, this stuff may penetrate armor, but it's going to pollute Ukraine. You don't want that. Reject the shells, and I hope they'll get that message.
Frankie Lee, I've been worried about that depleted uranium. Shouldn't that be illegal to use by international agreement?
Yeah, I wish it was, but it's they have some international agreements, but they're very restrictive. The poison gas is violates international agreements, but nuclear weapons don't, because I was reading about it the other day, because its primary intent is not to kill by chemicals. It's not a chemical weapon. It's to blow you apart, and radiation, that's nowhere mentioned. So, we wish international agreements would ban it. But even if they did, I don't know the precise name of it, but nuclear weapons, explosive nuclear weapons, have been banned by this international agreement signed by 150 countries, and it went into effect, I think, the beginning of last year. Except none of the countries that have nuclear bombs signed it, so they just ignored it. So that's pretty sad. Then there was another question that was on the screen for a second, and
Excited Monkey, I may have missed this, but why is depleted uranium being used in munitions at all?
it's a great penetrator. It's very, very dense, and so they use it to go through armor or go through a building or whatever. And it's also used the other way. They use it in armor to protect against a bullet or something like that.
Yeah, tanks and these armored vehicles to move soldiers around the battlefield is, what has the depleted uranium armor. Some of them do, and what the depleted uranium shells are able to penetrate more effectively than other shells. So that's why they're being used. But the consequences of using them for the land on which they're used is devastating. Brant Gill, why is it a bad thing to have radioactive material so long as it's tucked safely away?
Okay, tell me how to tuck it safely away. They've been trying to think of how to do it for 80 years. I mean, quite seriously, there's been various plans, let's put it in old salt mines. And so they were going to do something like that. And then they found out salt mines weren't as impermeable as they thought. And things they had put as tests dripped out of them, and so on. There's really no safe place to put these things. And so they're keeping them around the nuclear power plants that made them. And they have some way to make them into a solid, but sometimes there's earthquakes and solid things break into pieces. And I'm certainly no expert on any of this stuff, but there's really no safe way to do this. I mean, there were people who said, "Oh, let's put it in rockets and shoot it to the sun." All right, it wouldn't hurt the sun, but if one of those rockets came back and hit the Earth, there might be a problem.
Yeah, and where it's stored now, all those spent fuel rods that are being stored along with the other nuclear waste in these caskets, those are all targets for terrorists. And they're scattered all over this country and over 400 nuclear power plant sites around the world. So it's a problem getting worse. And Stanley said, we don't have a solution.
And there's a number of good climate scientists, climate activists who support nuclear power. But I mean, that's wild. I mean, you want to have nuclear power plants everywhere, and so you have all this nuclear material all over the Middle East, for instance, and all those countries that are so unstable. I mean, that's crazy, especially now that we've learned that people will play hide and seek with these nuclear facilities.
And the renewables, wind and solar, are cheaper, and they come online faster. So if you really want to address climate change, you're wasting your money and time by building more nuclear power plants.
And it takes about 20 years before one of these things comes online. We don't have 20 years. We have 7 until we get to 2030. We have a countdown clock on our site, pepeace.org. If you go to our resources and then go to, I don't know, climate and nature, I think is the link. And you'll see a countdown clock going to 2030. That's what the IPCC said we had. And, at that point, we faced disaster and a tipping point. And meaning that once you go over it, it's like going over a cliff. You're not going to get back. In 100,000 years or something, maybe the problem will be okay. But we're facing incredible problems. And this last week we had a new report, a new doomsday report. They said it was the final report. I'll tell you a little problem we're having here in Connecticut. We had this one idea. We said the use of gasoline in Connecticut, just for lawn care, they burn 40 million gallons. That's million gallons a year just to trim lawns. Let's go electric. And so there was, there's all this money came down from, they call it the IRA, the inflation busting, that was Biden's term to have a climate bill. So there was billions and billions sent to the states for that. So the legislator said, all right, let's give $10 million to businesses and they could finance rebates. So if you bought an electric leaf blower or an electric lawnmower rather than gas powered, you get a rebate, maybe up to $100. So we were pushing that, and then yesterday they just stripped it out of the bill. What they're proud of doing, they're going to have tax cuts in Connecticut. Wonderful.
Chris Blankenhorn, and when it's fired and explodes, it's not contained. It's everywhere, in the air, in the soil, in the people it hits.
That's right.
Yeah. And
they're getting, another one. Oops.
Yeah, Amy L. Sachs, and then factor in environmental racism and think of who usually bears the burden of responsibility proximity to environmental toxins. Yeah, I mentioned this last week. I wrote a 10,000 word article. It's pending with its publication for 2 years. I may pull it from them and get it in another publication. I know we'll take it, but it was about environmental racism. And I looked at the whole history of the environmental justice movement, going back to the early 1970s, coming out of the civil rights movement. And I titled it, Environmental Justice Resists, but Environmental Racism Persists. It really hasn't changed overall. We win a victory here and there, but the general situation is polluting industries and toxic waste sites and so forth are targeted for poor, mostly community of color communities because they're politically the weakest and they can't resist. And we're still in that situation. And of course, when it comes to, as Stanley mentioned, what happened to the Navajos. I mean, the miners got lung cancer in high proportion, the uranium miners. And then they had a spill it to Puerto Rico. Well, my Spanish is bad. It's a river in New Mexico on the eastern edge of the Navajo reservation, and it's still toxic. It was tailings from uranium mining, and they were behind kind of a levee, and it broke. It's a total environmental disaster. Those people cannot get their drinking water from their aquifer or the surface water. That's just one example of many.
Now, this isn't nuclear, but in Connecticut, we had one of the last coal burning plants. And where was it? In a poor section of Bridgeport. And so, there was agitation. Greenpeace had somebody climb it and put out a banner and all that kind of stuff. Campaigns. And finally they said, all right, we're going to close it down. We're going to put in a gas-powered plant. So they're going to burn methane there. And that's what they did. Governor came, cut the ribbon. Oh, isn't this wonderful? So they're burning. It's the same site, the poor neighborhood in Bridgeport, our biggest city by population in Connecticut, and they're burning that stuff. Amazing.
Vicki Corden, can radioactive material be put away underground maybe 100 kilometers? Just a thought. Getting it to space is still very dangerous. Well, 100 kilometers, that's about 60 miles. We don't have the drilling technology to do that. I mean, by then, my geology is not that good, but I think you're getting into the mantle, which is, liquid metal, basically. So I don't think that's a possibility. I mean, as Stanley mentioned, they've looked for sites. One of them was Yucca Mountain in Nevada. And the Shoshone Indians, whose land that is, were definitely opposed. And then it turned out it wasn't geologically stable. It was subject to earthquakes, so it wasn't safe. So they are still looking for a stable site. And it's a problem that keeps getting worse the more we use nuclear power.
And what place is stable? I mean, Oklahoma was famous for not having earthquakes, and then they were fracking, right? And then they took all the waste from fracking, this water polluted with all kinds of nice chemicals and so on, and they started injecting it deep, deep in the earth. And they started having earthquakes, a lot of them. And I think they got up to 5 point something on that Richter scale, which isn't hideous, but it was causing damage. And then they stopped doing that. And the problem of earthquakes in Oklahoma has receded.
Amy L. Sachs. Also, I support if we can put the plant operators and shareholders in the rocket too.
Okay.
Well, I think it's still too risky. Hold the plant operators and shareholders to account. Nuclear power can't pay for itself. It requires massive subsidies. So the shareholders are getting a free ride. We should stop that.
Yeah, I mean, they always come up with, but we're on the cusp of a new generation of nuclear power plants that'll just feed off of nuclear waste. That article I wrote 8 years ago about the PBS special was talking about this wunderkind who had invented this new process. And, they spent a good deal of time on this person who had set up this company in 2013. So the company was only around for I forget the details, but she had only been out of college 2 years, and she's now, starting this company, and it was going to have a demonstration project in 2020, and I don't think anything's been heard of it, and I think it went out of business. Probably, I don't know what she's doing now, but the other thing about nuclear, it's considered a dying industry. They really can't get the bright students to go into the nuclear power industry. So, even if they come up with some fourth generation that they talk about, it's going to be very, very hard for them to put anything big on any kind of scale.
Yeah, domestically, nuclear is dying, but internationally, with Russia leading the way in exporting nukes, they're exporting it to a lot of countries like Saudi Arabia, India, that either have or want to have nuclear weapons. So nuclear power has a proliferation risk for nuclear weapons. And so internationally, I think there's some African countries that are set up to get nuclear power from Russia. So that's a concern. We need a nuclear non-proliferation treaty that covers nuclear power. Unfortunately, the existing non-proliferation treaty says we will promote nuclear power as an alternative to nuclear weapons, but it hasn't worked that way. And the nuclear issue is not being addressed really by politics anywhere but in Western Europe, where the Germans phasing it out. The Green Party had a big role in that. And in France, they're taking another look at it because they have all these nukes. They're very dependent on nuclear power, but now those nukes are getting old. They're offline a lot. When it's hot, the rivers can't cool them, so they have to shut them down in the summer when they have higher demand for air conditioning. They're not that reliable. So, but in other countries, it's seen as a sort of badge of that you're in the modern world now.
Mm.
If all your people are poor from building that nuclear power plant in a poor country, it's nuclear madness.
Now, getting back to the issue of banning imports of uranium from Russia, I think it would be a popular issue if people bring it up. I think generally people support the Ukrainians in this country. And, if you bring it up to people where you work or even to the legislators, what are they going to say? We're telling the Germans, how dare you, burn Russian natural gas? And we keep bringing in the uranium and the enriched uranium. It's something you can campaign on. It's not the biggest moneymaker, $1 billion for Russian industry. You compare that to like $100 billion for its fossil fuel exports, but you do everything you can. Bring it up.
Yeah, let's put the petition link in the chat again for people that might not have caught it at the beginning. Yeah, getting back to the question of why they're using depleted uranium, there are other shells that use heavy metals like tungsten that have the same effect. And while they don't have the radioactivity that depleted uranium does, when they explode and create dust, they also create chemical problems, of toxicity, like heavy metals tend to do when they're ingested. So while depleted uranium is particularly bad, war is bad for the environment because of all the stuff that gets thrown around, blown up. And then you got to deal with all the, fossil fuels burned and all the other waste generated. So it's another reason why the peace and environmental movements need to work together.
One reason they use depleted uranium, there's so much of it. When they concentrate the U-235, then the junk part that they're not going to be able to use, that's the depleted uranium. So they would like to use. So they use it. They use it on airplanes as ballast. I forgot. You could look it up. Do the Wikipedia search for depleted uranium, and they use it 5 or 10 things. And I suppose as long as the airplane doesn't crash, they're not going to have a problem with that. But man, oh man, things that human beings do. let's see.
Amy Sachs. With more and more climate-based disasters, keeping it safe is only going to get more difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the more we wait, the more difficult it becomes. It's that International Panel on Climate Change final report for the 6th assessment that was out last week, reiterated that, which they've been saying all along. And, that is very distressing, but you have to realize that to get that final wording approved, it had to be signed off by over 190 countries that are part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that includes all these petrostates like Saudi Arabia and Russia and the United States. So the report tends to be conservative, more conservative than the science really indicates. So this is just to say that this climate crisis is, it's a life or death question.
And so what do we get out of the current administration? They're doing some climate measures, mostly just incentives to go electric, when you actually have to stop burning fossil fuels. You have to do that. Then on the other hand, they continue with the immense subsidies to the oil companies. And now with Willow, they're going to go into Alaska and drill there. I think we can call, what was Obama's strategy called? All of the above. So Biden's, we could call everything, everywhere, all at once. To coin a phrase.
Yeah, I've been calling that Inflation Reduction Act, which is supposedly the greatest climate bill ever, Build Back Badly, because it promotes fossil fuels as much as it promotes renewables. And the other argument I've been making is that, it's too late for incentives and public contracts with private companies to do this. We really need to socialize the energy sector and plan the transition. It's the only way we can do it in the time frame needed, so we can coordinate this complicated transition. And so while the Democrats picked up the Green Party slogan of a Green New Deal, it's really been a sort of a Keynesian at best, neoliberal, even better description, where they're giving money and incentivizing the private sector rather than doing it through the public sector, like the original Green New Deal or the original New Deal did, for example, with the Civilian Conservation Corps. That was done. That was a public agency. They picked the jobs and the projects. What was proposed in Build Back Better, which never got implemented, was to do it through this agency that runs, what's it called? The Domestic Peace Corps, VISTA. So private entities would apply for grants to do it. So there was no coordination overall perspective on the work that the Civilian Climate Corps would do. And that's just an example of how what's being proposed for climate action is just not up to the task. Biden says he's going to cut carbon emissions by 52% by 2030. He said that when he introduced part of the Build Back Better package. And I have never been able to figure out where he got that number. I think they just pulled it out of their bottom, and because it sounded good. They don't have a plan for that, and that's a problem.
One other thing, and I just put in the private chat a link to a flyer we are promoting Enduring Peace distribute. Besides all those good things you mentioned, Howie, there's the idea of rationing. We rationed the use of fuel during World War II. There's even a bigger reason to do it now. We're going to go off the cliff, and we ration now by price. If you got the money, you can get all the fuel you want. But you could ration by need, and you could say, well, it's important for people to be warm in the winter. It's important to people to get to work. But other things are, luxury, some kind of transport, airplane rides for the jet set and so on is not that important. So we're going to hold back on that. We're going to, allow just very little of that. So that's something to consider. So I hope that link got put in the comments. And if not, you can always go to pepeace.org and see our various ideas on climate and so on.
Yeah, it was put in the comments, and
Okay.
I just put it in my browser and it came up, so it's a good link. Well, we've come up on the hour, Stanley. Anything you would like to conclude with?
No, I'm good. We need very radical changes. We need to take over of the fossil fuel industry. We need rationing. We need a ban of imports of Russian uranium. And we got to phase out really swiftly from Diablo Canyon out in California, which they just gave more life to last year, and the stuff we have in Connecticut and all over. We got to get away from this foolish nuclear power. Appreciate you having me on the show.
Well, thanks for coming on, Stanley, and I hope people will sign that petition and begin talking up this issue. Depleted uranium munitions apparently being used by all sides in this war. And as bad as the war is, this makes it even worse. And, coming back home, as I opened up with, we got a crazy man leading the Republican presidential nomination in the polls, who's basically calling for death and destruction and the abandonment of democratic processes, and a Democrat who in Europe would be a conservative. He'd be in the Christian Democrats in Germany. And so there's a huge vacuum on the left. And, it's really up to us to organize. And as I've said, we got to start at the local level. That's where we can begin winning races, establishing a political base, and then run credibly for state legislature and the House of Representatives on that foundation. That's how we're going to, begin to turn this country around. And as we do that, we should be fighting for reforms in the electoral system, which is exclusionary. It pits, makes alternatives to the two major parties, quote unquote, spoilers, because it's a winner take all single member district system. So we need to push for ranked choice voting and proportional ranked choice voting for legislative bodies to open up the political system and have a multi-party democracy where the things that the Greens promote, you poll them just on the policies and they have majorities or supermajorities. Single payer health care, Green New Deal, canceling student debt. These are very popular policies, but we can't get them through the two-party system. So there's an opening for us, and it's really up to us to fill it. So
I just want to say that promoting enduring peace, we're not an electoral organization of any kind. We get into the matter of issues, and that's why we're on the show today. So we have private sympathies, but we are not an electoral organization at all.
Yeah, and we don't want to put your status in jeopardy. But speaking for as a Green and as a socialist, that's what I'm urging us to do. And so we'll be here next week. I did get a yes from Svetlana Romanko, who's a Ukrainian environmentalist. She's running an organization now called Razom We Stand, which means Together We Stand, which is about international solidarity with Ukraine and climate action. And, she's done a lot of work. She got some notoriety because she called out the Russians at the COP summit, the UN, climate summit in Egypt last fall. And they threw her out of the conference, but she told off the Russian representatives. She spent a lot of time working with Bill McKibben and 350.org. And now she's got this other organization, which is, asking for solidarity. And when the war is over, a green reconstruction of Ukraine. So I asked her to come on Earth Day. She's already occupied, but she's going to pick another Saturday. So she'll be coming on one of these Saturdays. And meanwhile, have a great week, everybody. And we'll see you next week.
So long.